So while my gearbox casing is in the oven getting warmed up so it's easier to assemble, it's a good chance to actually look at this with the gears laid out so you can see how they work. So this gear at the bottom is the reverse gear, and this one here is the lay shaft. So the way this works is it's all concentric shafts. The input shaft is this one here. We can see if I hold all this, it's a bit tricky because it's resting on here, but this spins independently. So the input comes in here, and normally the lay shaft is meshing with these two gears here. So when the input is engaged, this lay shaft is always spinning. This is all one piece. The output shaft is connected to this middle section here. So if I hold all this, we should be able to, you can turn that one independently. This gear rotates freely on this upper shaft, and this is normally driven by the lay shaft here. So two things slide. This whole thing slides backwards and forwards, which is what gives you third gear and fourth gear. So you can see these teeth here, these dog teeth, engage when you slide this all the way forwards. So that's actually top gear. So the drive now connects all the way through straight to the output shaft. Third gear is similar in that these dog teeth here engage with this wheel. So like that. And that'll give you third. These gears would be in neutral, somewhere in the middle there. If you slide this forward, so this is disengaged again, that would be neutral because there are no gears meshing. It's a bit awkward. You can see there's clearance here. And so your other two gears, first and second, are engaged by sliding this cluster on this middle piece. And you can see how that then engages these different ratios here. Reverse is done with this gear. And what it seems to do is engages in with this and this one. So it engages like that to give you reverse. That's pretty much it. It's pretty straightforward. The reason they call it a silent third is because, as you can see, the first and second gears are straight cut. These are straight cut gears, and these will be very noisy. Race cars often use straight cut gears, and they have a real whine to them, the gearboxes. So when first or second aren't engaged, the third gear is this direct drive through these dogs, and that's all through, the drive is all through these helical cut gears. So that's where the silent comes into it. Silent's going to be relative, of course, because it is a vintage gearbox, so it's always going to be fairly noisy, but that's one of the joys of vintage cars. So I have the reverse gear and the lay shaft cluster back in the gearbox now. One thing to note is the lay shaft here, there's gaskets, paper gaskets that go underneath the head of the shaft, and these have to be set so that the lay shaft can rotate in there, but you have the right amount of end float. Now, I haven't actually been able to figure out exactly what that should be. There aren't exactly manuals around for these that I've found. So what I did was, when I took it apart, I was very careful to keep the gaskets. I didn't reuse them, but I kept them so that I could measure the thickness, and there were actually two gaskets in there to give a very specific thickness. So when I made my new gaskets, I made sure I got the same thickness, and that seems to have worked. So this rotates freely. The reverse gear shaft doesn't have the same problem. There is a gasket there, but I guess that's just for sealing, because the reverse gear actually rotates on the shaft, so it's free to move there. Bit of gunk there. I'll probably have to put this back in the oven and heat it up again so that I can get the rear housing and also the front back in. One really important thing to note is where the input shaft comes down onto the main shaft there, there's a little tiny ball bearing on the end here. and that's to take up the thrust on here. So that little ball goes inside there, so that can spin. So I'll probably throw this back in the oven and then reassemble the rest of it. I've decided to stop working on the gearbox just for now because I've had a little bit of a snag, or rather something that's confusing me at the moment. The gearbox all went together fine, but when I bolted on this front plate here, this plate fits into the front of the gearbox, and it's what the bearing that fits inside here pushes up against. So this plate actually has a step that fits into the casing that the bearing then pushes up against. And then when you push the gear home, this input gear, it pushes up hard against the bearing. When I took all this apart and reassembled it, there was this rather thick gasket between the plate and the gearbox. So this gasket is about 0.65 of a millimeter thick. So with that in place, it meant the bearing was slightly forward, and I found that this gear, this input gear, would then rub on the inside case of the gearbox. So I've reassembled it without that gasket, and it seems a lot better. I end up with about 3 thou of clearance there. It's 2.5 to 3 thou of clearance, and it all seems to be working okay. So I'm not certain if there should be a gasket there or not. The other gearbox I haven't taken it apart, but it looks like there is no gasket there, so I don't know what is actually correct. So I'm actually going to stop, and I'm going to ask for some advice on that. The other thing we can see here is this is where I did my weld. It's basically a lump of weld over the top of the crack, but that should hold up fine, I think. The shaft that goes through here doesn't even actually rotate. It's just a straight shaft through, and it has the pedals on one side, and on the inside there's this tube that goes in there with the shaft running through it and the arms that work the clutch release mechanism. So that should all be good now. The other thing that I've done this weekend is I'm going to get my wheels rebuilt by a guy down in Christchurch who rebuilds these sort of things and builds them new. So the problem is these wheels are very, very rusty. I think if we look on this one, you can see all the pitting, and this one has actually been, you can see where somebody's tried to weld it in the past to build it up, but these rust from the inside out, I think. So if it's this bad on the top, it's going to be worse inside. So I don't want to use these. Now, what I can do is reuse the centers. So I have basically, using an angle grinder, you cut the spokes out just with a cutting disc on the angle grinder. You cut it here where the spokes cross, which is the safest place to do it. And the first few cuts are quite interesting because there's a lot of tension in here, and it sort of jumps around, springs around. But once you've done the first few, it's fine. All the tension goes out of it, and you just blast around and cut the spokes out. So I've got a big box of old spokes there. Some of those are quite rusty. You can see the rims are fairly rusty as well. So I'm going to be sending down the 3 centers there and this whole wheel. And he needs a wheel because he needs to know what the offset is to rebuild the wheels. So it's not going to be cheap, but really this is all that's holding the car up when you're driving it. So you really want a good set of wheels. So I think it's going to be worth the expense. Then I'll also have to get really good tyres for it, which is also going to be expensive, but what can you do? And for people who are worried I've stopped working on the Austin 7, I did start doing some of the planishing on the wings today. I've basically done in an hour a first pass of one side of one wing. Like I say, that took an hour, and it's better, but it's nowhere near done. So I've just been planishing it and then filing it to see where the high spots are. Just trying to blend it all in, get it smooth. This side is a lot smoother. You can see the side I haven't done is all lumpy still. So hopefully I can keep going on that. Maybe I'll do an hour every night. Obviously there's 4 guards, so that's 8 sides to do. But I'll get there eventually.